Well, turn back with me to John 18, and we were looking at chapter 18 and dipping into some of chapter 19 this evening. So we're now at the point in John's Gospel of Jesus' arrest. We've seen through what's called the upper room discourse as Jesus prepares his disciples for life after his departure. And you see in that something of his care and his thought and his compassion for his disciples and for the work that would go on afterwards, after his departure. And we saw last time Jesus' prayer as he leaves the upper room with his disciples to go to the garden where he knows he will be arrested. And in it we saw something of Jesus' heart as we knew he is moments, keenly aware, he's moments away from the point when he will be taken and arrested and tried and cruelly executed. What was it that was uppermost in his heart? We saw he had a heart for God and for his glory, praying that the cross would bring glory to God. We saw his heart of compassion for his disciples, for the fact that they would be going into a godless world with all kinds of problems and snares and difficulties, and his refrain is simply, keep them. He wanted them to go out and serve him, but he earnestly prays for them to be kept. And we saw what he called his heart of reconciliation and peace, as he looks to the restoration of all things through the cross, as he looks for the curse to be overturned through what he would do at the cross, and the eternal blessings for those who would believe in him through the disciples' message. Just a bit of an aside, John's gospel at this point is very different to some of the other gospel accounts. And sometimes we look at the differences and we think, well, why are they different? Why are they telling us slightly different things? And there's a number of things you can say about that, and we won't go into any detail. But just here, I think it's important to know that John's gospel was the last written, and we've every reason to suppose that John knew people would have already read the other gospel accounts and have an idea of them. And so he's adding his own memories, his own recollections, rather than duplicating what they're saying, he's adding to it through his own account. If all the gospel writers were the same, if they told everything exactly the same, you could be sure there was some sort of collusion. You know that with eyewitnesses. Part of the reason you know they're true is if they give you slightly different accounts, because they see things different ways, different times, perhaps from a different angle, and see things slightly differently. So what is it then that John is drawing our attention to through this part of his gospel? Well, we look at Jesus' arrest, his betrayal, and the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy that he must be despised and rejected. I'm going to take some fairly broad brushstrokes. I'm aware there's a lot of subplots going on here that we will largely skate over. Maybe we'll return next time to look at the subplot with Pilate, we'll see. But some of the other gospel writers seem to have more interest in some of those subplots, like Peter's denial, but John seemed to have something different in mind. So what is John telling us? Well, the first thing I think he's telling us, very simply, is that Jesus had to be despised and rejected. So we read Isaiah 53 earlier, where it says, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. And John 18 effectively tells us how Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled, as everyone either despises him or rejects him or hides their faces from him in shame and fear. So it starts as Jesus is despised and rejected by Judas. You see that in verses 2 and 3. If you remember, think back at the Passover, Jesus had offered Judas the bread dipped in the bowl. We don't have anything like it, but for then, it was a symbol of love and affection and friendship. And the chilling statement that John records in his gospel is that once Judas had taken the bread, Satan entered into him. He closed his heart to Jesus and he opened his heart to the devil. And Judas leaves the upper room, and John records that it was night. Remember, we said he wasn't just telling us the blindingly obvious that night follows day, but rather he was saying he was going out where it was spiritually dark. Spiritually dark. And now, as the first recorded to despise and reject Jesus is Judas, the one who had gone into the darkness. Jesus must face a rigged trial, a barbaric execution, but also what Judas represents here, the mass ranks of darkness and evil. But Jesus is then despised and rejected by the Jewish leaders. And you see that in stages, verses 12 to 14, verses 19 to 24, verses 28 to 31. Now, the Jewish leaders, we know, had collaborated with Judas. They had paid him the money to betray Jesus, to lead the cohort of soldiers at a time when the crowd wouldn't riot, and so he leads them to the garden. And through his gospel account, John records some of the things that these leaders had said and done, and tells us something about them. So, for example, when they interrogate the man born blind that Jesus had healed, you quickly see that these are men fueled with pride, with a desire to be looked up to, and with a desire to control others. And that quickly became hatred of Jesus as he exposes their shallowness and their hypocrisy. Excuse the pun, but the man born blind points out to them the blindingly obvious that they can't see. And so as a result, they throw him out of the synagogue. They're full of pride, they're full of hatred, they're full of hypocrisy. They have no charges, and yet they insist that Jesus be crucified. And yet at the same time, in verses 28 and 29, they didn't want to enter Pilate's palace in case they became ceremonially unclean. And you look and you think there's the staggering hypocrisy of that comment. But sadly, outward religion can blind us to the state of our hearts. You may not be condemning someone this evening the way they were, but the same pride that they had in their hearts will keep multitudes out of heaven. You see, it will include you if you're not prepared to humble yourself before God, if you're not prepared to admit that you're in the wrong, if you're too proud to accept God's forgiveness. And as we see here, the hold of power and pride often linger and lurk under a religious cloak. They didn't want to defile themselves, it says, by going into Pilate's palace. Murder, that's okay, but to defile myself and not be able to eat the Passover, oh no, I can't do that, he says, would have made them unclean. Power and pride distort everything, values, everything that there is in life. And sadly, it's true even amongst real Christians. Can trample and discard any who might threaten my hold on power. And here, those that were tasked with leading the nation spiritually despise and reject Christ because he threatens their position and challenges their hypocrisy. But then Jesus is despised and rejected by Peter. And again, you see it in stages, verses 15 to 18, then verses 25 to 27. There's a very brief mention of the other disciples in verse 8, and we depend on the disciples to tell us what happened to them. But the sad thing is, we think of Peter as the good guy. Here's the good guy, and yet here we see the deceitfulness of the human heart as he and the other disciples abandon Jesus. You can see John's oblique reference in verse 8 to the others, where Jesus asks that they be let go. And the other gospel writers tell us that they turned tail and ran. Peter had vowed he'd lay down his life for Jesus. Yes, all the others they'd run, but not him. And so he starts swinging at others and trying to resolve the situation in his own strength. And how often that's true of you and me. Thinking that somehow we're God's answer, thinking we can do it in all our strength. And all that happens is the same as happened with Peter. Other people get hurt and we make a fool of ourselves. Peter then follows John into the high priest's courtyard. And there he's put on the spot. And there he denies Jesus 3 times. Peter didn't know his own heart. And if we're honest, for you and me, we don't either. All the others would fall away, but he wouldn't. You know, that sense of I can handle it. I don't need your help. And yet in the hour of crisis, he denies Jesus. Peter didn't know his own heart. You see, as Jeremiah says, the human heart is deceitful above all else. Who can understand it? Who can understand it? And in the context of the unfolding story that John is telling us, the key thing that he's telling us here is that God's work is progressing despite us and not because of us. But then Jesus is despised and rejected by Pilate, as you see from verse 28 to verse 38, and then goes on into chapter 19, which we didn't read. We'll perhaps return to this in more detail next time. But here, Pilate makes the state's rejection of Christ as he sentenced Jesus to be crucified. Now, Pilate's generally depicted as a kind of weak and vacillating ruler who didn't have the courage to stick with his convictions. And actually, that's quite a superficial reading of the gospel accounts. The way that Roman rule in Judea was structured, it's a bit like a sort of devolved assembly in this country. So Pilate shared a degree of civil and religious power with the Jewish authorities. And so cooperation and support were key to getting things done. And so here it's fairly clear there must have been some sort of collusion, given that Judas arrives with the authorities to arrest Jesus with a detachment of soldiers. Now, the way it says detachment of soldiers means, A, it was a large number, and B, they would have been Roman. Probably the rest was being made by the temple guards, but there's a big number of Roman soldiers coming as well. So clearly, there's been some discussions in the background and arrangements have been made. Pilate had a reputation for aggravating the Jews, sometimes violently. If you remember, Luke mentions in passing the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. He clearly wasn't a very nice man. Historians like Josephus suggested that on a couple of occasions, Pilate had had to back down to the Jews. Once because they dug in and refused to do what he wanted to. In a choice, he either had to slaughter them and face the consequences, which could have badly influenced his position, and once because his higher authorities told him that he had to. So he's got a political job to do. He has to keep the peace as the first priority. Jerusalem is packed with worshippers, all of them with heightened emotions. And Pilate knows that Jesus was popular and he doesn't want a riot on his hands. So he's got a game to play, but at the same time, he's got to keep in with the Jewish leaders. So he plays the political game. And his interrogations and his actions basically have 2 things to sort out. First of all, he needs to see if Jesus is indeed a threat to the state. He clearly despises Jews in his heart. You get glimpses of that, the way that John records this. And in front of him, he sees what he thinks is a weak and pitiable example of the Jews. But after his questioning, he clearly sees this man is no threat. He can go free. But he also has to establish a way to deal with Jesus without a backlash from the authorities or a riot from the crowd. It's a political game as far as Pilate's concerned. It's all part of the job. It's interesting, as you read into chapter 19, you realise that even this hardened man has a conscience, and he's alarmed by some of Jesus' words and behaviour. But he squashes the conviction and sees his political game through. You can do the same thing. You can squash conviction, you can push it away. But Pilate never got another chance, and maybe you weren't either. So Pilate delivers the state's rejection of Jesus, and he has him flogged and then crucified. But then Jesus is despised and rejected by the crowd, verses 39 to 40. See, part of Pilate's political game is to offer Barabbas as an alternative to Jesus. Who do you prefer? And they shout for Barabbas. Shortly after, in chapter 19, Jesus is brought out having been flogged, presented to the crowd with Pilate saying, "Here's your king." But they shout, "Take him away, crucify him." And you think back, this is the same crowd that just a few days earlier had cut palm branches and cried, "Hosanna." Quoting from Psalm 118, they'd shouted their messianic praise as Jesus comes in to Jerusalem. Here was the Messiah King. They recognized him for who he was. And yet now these same people are shouting, "Crucify." The fickleness of the human heart. Your heart and mine, deceitful above all else and beyond cure. It's interesting, Barabbas was a freedom fighter, according to what John tells us. He was some sort of figure, the sort of figure that the Jews would have wanted from their Messiah. And he may well have been seen as something of a hero by some of the people. The crowd wanted what he represented. Interestingly, Barabbas just means son of the Father. Bar, son, Abba, Father. Barabbas. The crowd rejects the true Son of the Father in favour of a violent freedom fighter. But then lastly, Jesus is despised and rejected by the soldiers. As you read on into chapter 19, Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they slapped him in the face. The soldiers had a job to do. In a sense, for them, it was all very matter of fact, all in a day's work. But this one was different. The King of the Jews, his chance for a bit of fun. They couldn't pass up the opportunity. See, crucifixion was designed to humiliate. It was designed to humiliate the scum of society. And so they do their job, and they add to it their mock worship and humiliation. Jesus rightly wears the crown of heaven. He was and he is God's forever king. And yet he exchanged his royal crown for a crown of thorns. He was and he will be worshipped through eternity. And yet he submits himself to mock worship by these soldiers. The royal robes of kingship were rightly his, and yet he's stripped to be flogged, and ultimately even his clothing is taken from him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. The account tells us something of the fallen state of mankind. None is found righteous, all are found wanting. Romans 3 and verse 10, there is no one righteous, not even one. It tells you something of your own heart, the fickleness, the hypocrisy, the pride. You may want to see yourself as one of the good guys, but actually your heart is as deceitful as anyone here and beyond cure. All hide their faces from Jesus, all reject him. But it had to be that way. It had to be that way. Jesus must face the cross alone. No one else could do anything about the state of the human heart. Only Jesus could, and so he must go alone. As the old hymn says, there was no other good enough to pay the price of sin. He only could unlock the gate of heaven and let us in. Isaiah's prophecy must be fulfilled. He must face the massed ranks of darkness on his own. And so Jesus is despised and rejected. But that's not all that John wants us to get. Because as we see him despised and rejected, you also see that he is in complete control. Surprisingly, he is in complete control of what is going on. How do we react to what John tells us? What do you think of it? Are we to pity Jesus and lament the way that he was treated? You see, at a number of points through the narrative, John wants us to grasp that this is no tragedy unfolding. This is so much more than just a simple, unjust arrest and trial. This wasn't just the horribleness of human sin having its way. This was the will of God, and Jesus is in complete control through the narrative. You see it in the melee as the soldiers come to arrest Jesus. The account tells us it was the soldiers who draw back and fall to the ground. You see in verse 6. He says, taken from verse 5, they're looking for who? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus said, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Now, our translations don't really capture what's going on here. Verse 5 literally says, I am. Our translators have added the he to it. I am, the declaration that God had given to Moses at the burning bush when Moses asks him what his name is. The declaration of the self-existent God who always was and always is. So verse 6 would read better if it said, when he said to them, I am, they drew back and fell to the ground. Maybe that was the temple guard coming to make the actual arrest with the Roman soldiers there in the background in case there was a riot. They recognized his claim and they fall to the ground. And yet Jesus willingly submits himself to them and he seeks the safety of his disciples in verse 8. Verse 4 tells us that he's in control. It says Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, who is it you want? He took the initiative. He willingly goes with the arresting army. And interestingly, at the hour of his arrest, his concern is for his disciples. You see in verse 8. He says, if you're looking for me, then let these men go. You know, the compassion of the Saviour for you and for me, as he had for his disciples then. Everything had looked forward to this hour. We've seen that a number of times in John's Gospel. When Jesus says the hour has come. It's his destiny. It's not taking him by surprise. He's already prayed in the last chapter that God will be glorified through it. And so he submits to all that will be done to him. John has an interesting little aside in verse 5, where it says, Jesus says, I am, and then says in brackets, and Judas the traitor was standing there with them. Here is the Judas who has given himself to the devil, who has opened his heart to the devil, and it's a sign that Jesus will face the massed powers of darkness. And yet it's Jesus, the one who's in control. It's Jesus who calls the shots, and he submits to the Father's will. And as you read on in the discussions with Pilate, again, John is telling us who's actually in control through this. Was it Pilate who condemned him? Well, not according to Jesus. You see in chapter 19, verse 10 and 11. Pilate says, do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said, don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, you would have no power over me if it were not given you from above. Therefore, the one who handed you over to me is guilty of a greater sin. And John also presents the interesting contrast between Jesus and Peter. Peter's fear compared to Jesus' trust. Peter tried to stay in control. Somehow he sought to get things to happen his way. But you see, he didn't see the end from the beginning, and so he acts foolishly. Jesus is in complete control. Unlike us, he sees the end, he sees the purpose, and he submits obediently to all that is happening. Acts 4:27 and 28. The apostles look back and say, indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. They did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. So Jesus is despised and rejected, and yet he is in complete control simply because there was no other way. There was no other way. Verse 11, Jesus makes a telling statement to Peter. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" What was this cup? The other gospel writers tell us that in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus had prayed in agony. He looked to the Father and he said, "If it be possible, let this cup pass from me." The cup was filled with dread to such an extent that Luke tells us that Jesus sweat great drops of blood. A number of Old Testament references identify the phrase "the cup" either as a cup of blessing or a cup of wrath. And here it's the latter. So, for example, Isaiah 51, shortly before the passage we read, says this: "Awake, wake, rise up, Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath." Here it is. Here is the cup of God's wrath that Jesus will drink. He will face the wrath of an angry God in the place of sinners. He always sensed his destiny. That phrase, "the hour," is repeated many times in John's Gospel. A few moments earlier, Jesus prayed, "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you." He shrunk back from the horror. He prays that there might be another way. And here is Peter, in a sense, giving him the opportunity for that out. And yet he says to Peter, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" There was no other way. And so he bears your sin and mine to the place of judgment. And as you read these things, as you see him despised and rejected, as you see his control, as you see his willingness to obey the Father's will, you need to keep saying to yourself, "That was for me. He did it because he loved me. He did it in my place. He did it because he wanted me. It was all for me." Isaiah 53 again. "He was despised and rejected by mankind, like a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we're healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all."